Hey, Made in America listeners. Whether this is your first show or you've been with us for 5 years, thank you so much for joining us. Please spread the word about what we're doing and the great things that are happening in manufacturing with somebody you know. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Made in America podcast. Really excited to have a friend of Compass MSPs on with us today, Rick Skidmore, founder and CEO of Timberlane. Rick, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Ari. How are you?
Doing very well, thanks. All the better for finally getting you on the show. So looking forward to having our conversation. But it's the Made in America podcast, Rick. So we always start off with the same two questions. What do you make and why do you make it?
What do I make? So we make custom exterior window shutters for residential homes, commercial properties, and historic properties. So
And why do you guys do that? What's
why do we
the
make it?
the why behind Timberlane?
Yeah. So I'd say there's probably two whys. One is because nobody else was doing it well when I had the idea to start the business. There were a couple companies that existed, but I didn't feel they did it very well. So I decided to start a business and do it myself. And the second reason is, I love period architecture and really high quality construction. And in that space, it's all about quality and details and getting it right. And getting back to number one, which is because nobody was doing it well, when you love architecture and love quality, you want to try to do it right.
Well, listen, quality is a number one, right? We got to make sure the customer's satisfied and getting them what they need in a market that's looking to be
Yeah.
served. And I definitely want to talk about that, which we definitely will. And we have some other critical topics that that I want to talk about, both including kind of your use and leveraging of an amalgam of different strategic operating systems that business owners and entrepreneurs talk about. I
Mhm.
also definitely want to get into what I think is really one of the core interesting things we'll talk about today, which is that it isn't just about a quality product, but it's about the sales and marketing to make sure people know who you are. That's
Yeah.
critical to business success. You've got a lot to say about that, and always fascinating talking about people's view on corporate culture and the value culture can bring to a successful organization. So
Yeah.
we want to get to all those topics, and we will. But I also always enjoy a good origin story, and we have a lot of similarities in our background of how we got to the places that we're in and the successes there. And I'd love to start with you had referenced starting the business,
Right.
but it wasn't your first career. So I wonder if you could kind of walk us through the origin story of Timberlane.
Sure. Sure. So probably not unlike most young people in college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I, was on a pre-law track, thought I wanted to be a lawyer. Everybody told me from the time I was a young kid that, I can sell anything to anybody. So you should get up there and argue, right? So I believed it and thought, well, let me be a lawyer. It seemed like a good thing to do and something that would certainly make my parents proud, right? And so I set out on that path and quickly realized in school I just was not I was not driven. I was not inspired by the traditional academic path. So I got through it, but it wasn't something that really inspired me. And in the morning, I was enthusiastic to run the class. So, I graduated with a dual major in psychology and criminal justice, right? So what do you do with that if you decide you don't want to be a lawyer? So you get into sales, right? So I got into sales for a large financial services company and started that path, with a large, Fortune 100 New York firm, and started doing really well and understanding that industry and that business. But there was always a piece missing for me. There was always, you know, I was a very tactile, very hands-on person, and I was selling, interest rates and all these theoretical things, and I couldn't put my hands around something at the end of the day. So I started to get itchy to start my own business, and I really didn't know what. I was driven more towards the idea of having my own business than I was, towards a specific type of business. So at around the same time, I had an old home in Bucks County, Pennsylvania that I was restoring, and I was doing a top to bottom restoration, and I was kind of nearing the end of it, and at that time of my project, the old shutters on the house were mostly gone and rotted and falling apart. And at that point, I was, in my mid 20s, and, I was a reasonably competent DIY woodworker. I had a small shop in my house. I was hardly a professional, but I decided I was going to make the shutters myself. So I went looking for a company that did it for real, right? so I could get their catalog and reverse engineer and design inspiration, right? And this was 1995, so it was early, like I would almost argue pre-internet, right? So I was not Googling. I was jumping in the car and I was going to lumber yards and millwork houses. And, honestly, the big Home Depot and Lowe's, the big boxes, as we call them, didn't even exist then, too. So, you know, I would go in these stores and I'd say, look, I want to buy shutters. I want to buy custom shutters, like the old type of shutters. And they would just go, no, no, they don't make them anymore. You got to go with these plastic ones. I'm like, yeah, but I don't want the plastic ones. I want something that looks authentic and, something like I took down. And, I didn't know it at the time because I was just really young and really driven by an idea, but I didn't understand anything about market research or focus groups or anything like that. But I was actually in the middle of one and didn't realize it, right? So I'm talking to all these people and they're going, nope, they don't make them anymore. Nope, they don't make them anymore. And somewhere along the line, I guess that was my light bulb moment. And I thought, I've got this old home and it needs shutters. And I'm a little bit of an anomaly because I'm a hobbyist woodworker and I'm going to make them myself for my home. But I realize most people aren't going to make them themselves. They're going to look for a company to buy them. And then the marketer in me popped in and went, you hate your job. You want to own your own business. You want to be able to have control over your future. This might be it. So that was kind of the infancy and kind of my origin story. And then from there, it was, a whirlwind over what's now coming.
Off to the races, as they
Off to
say.
the races, exactly.
So there's a couple things that, there's people that listen to the show, some of whom are probably thinking about, getting their own business. And there's a couple things I want to pull out of this that I think are really interesting and special. So I guess, one of the things about many things that we sort of overlap on is this like failed lawyer path, or maybe, by the way, the way we probably should look at it is a successful failed lawyer path.
Right.
What was it that gave you that business entrepreneur spirit? I mean, was it something that was you saw at home? Were either of your parents business owners? Like, where did that sort of entrepreneurial spirit? Because you sort of said the whole time, no matter what you were doing, that sort of entrepreneur in you was there. Where did that come from?
Yeah, I've thought about this most of my life, and I've got great parents and great role models, and I learned all of my values, from them, and I credit them for a lot, hard work, and integrity, and all that. But neither of them were entrepreneurs, right? So I think for me, it's either you develop it or you're born with it, right? And I think at some level, I think you're born with certain drives and certain I don't even know how to articulate it. Not frustrations, but you're just kind of driven, right? You want to do something, right? And from the time I was a young age, I mean, I used to pick weeds on the side of the road, wrap them up in foil, and stand on a corner in the middle of the city and sell flower arrangements, right? So, whatever I could do to make a buck, whether I was cutting somebody's grass or selling greeting cards door to door, or cleaning out attics, I did everything, right? So I was always kind of driven towards that, right?
So
So
in the classic, is an entrepreneur made or born
yeah.
debate, you're firmly on the born side.
Yeah, but I want to be careful how I answer that because I think you can have an advantage where maybe you've got this inert drive, right, where you're born with it. But then I also think you can really, you can learn how to be that too, especially today with the availability of just limitless resources for education and learning. And so I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think you could be born with it, but then if you don't execute and you don't take advantage of that gift, then it's going to go nowhere either, right? So at some point you've got to, get things moving.
So, let's say, so we've got some of the innate kind of traits in you, right, that makes you want to go do it. And then you have this idea. And I guess you sort of talked a little bit about not doing a direct focus group, but sort of doing one inadvertently or by, well, whatever, right? You had one that you sort of did, but you're also in such a niche market. And so I'm I got two questions, but I won't give you the two-parter. I'll start with one and then the follow-up, which is,
Sure.
how did you know, or what gave you the confidence, if anything, or maybe it was just, lack of experience that made you not even worry, that there was a big enough market? Because certainly, to your point, people aren't making, making the traditional wood shutters anymore for all the reasons you outlined. But people also aren't probably making horse-drawn carriages the way that they used to either. But I don't know that there's a market for a business for that. So how did you think about that at the outset?
In a very scrappy, intuitive way, right? And I remember very clearly. I think towards the end of this idea that kind of came to me, and I was really trying to make a decision. All right, do I believe in this enough that I want to like quit my job where I was making a lot of money and do this. And I took a walk, and I live in a fairly small town in Bucks County. And at the time, I just took a walk through the borough, right? And just a couple hour walk, and I just started counting homes. I started counting old homes that had shutters or used to have shutters, or there was evidence that shutters was there and there was no shutters anymore. And I remember getting to several hundred of them. And then, the sales guy in me goes, all right, well, if I can sell 1 in 10, right? So that was literally it, Ari. I wish I could sit here and give you a more sophisticated answer, but that was really it. And I also think that ignorance is bliss, right? So when you find this idea and you're driven, sometimes I think the absence of going full on corporate to try to like validate, I think becomes an advantage, because what you don't know, there's nothing to stand in the way of your momentum.
Yeah, well, listen, also you're absolutely going to lose any type of first mover advantage, and probably also some of your passion, because you weren't passionate about doing case studies. You were
Yeah.
passionate about the woodworking.
Yeah.
And so let me kind of pivot to that, the second part of the question, which was where you were already a hobbyist in woodworking, kind of as you outlined. Where did that sort of come from? And I got to follow on to that. I mean, where did you get introduced to woodworking?
Oh, that's an easy one. That's from my dad, right? So my dad is a master woodworker, if you will, and he spent, I don't know, 30, 40 years as a really talented pattern maker, which is a bygone trade, but that was a trade where they used to actually make wooden patterns for large parts for boats and ships and things like that. And he worked at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. And so I was around woodworking from a young age. And, my dad was very handy. He always did stuff around the house. He was a great father in the sense that he would grab me and go, come here, I want you to help me. I want to show you what I'm doing. And I just took to it. And so I definitely credit him for, I guess, giving me that kernel of interest, that, I could do something that I don't know or haven't done before just by learning and trial and error.
So taking that, which is clearly linked to a childhood memory, it's sort of a passion, hobby. Imagine in the time you were in corporate America and you're looking for sort of the stress relief. This is the thing. Was there any second doubts or hesitation of taking your, I'll call it the escape, the release, the stress valve, and making that the front and center sort of vocation that now you actually have to make something out of it? You can't just sort of tinker in the garage. Was there any hesitation in making that pivot?
So I didn't. So wow, you really hit on something, on a big idea here, right? So I didn't know it at the time, but what you said is exactly what happened. I took my hobby and my stress reliever, and all of a sudden I turned it into my profession and my business, right? So I lost my hobby, and I lost my hobby probably for 25 years, right? Because the shop I had in my house, I don't think I ever went in there again. And, I used to think that if I wanted to do a woodworking project, now I have this great commercial woodworking industrial facility, I could just do it there. But I can tell you, maybe only once or twice in 25 years, I actually did that. And it's not until very recently that I kind of dusted off my hobby and realized, I miss it. So I actually put a home shop in my house again. And I'd say in the last, 4 or 5 years, I kind of started to slowly get my hobby back, and I started to take on projects and build furniture and things like that again. So you have to be careful, right? Because, a hobby that turns into a business can be a great thing, but then, you have to be cognizant that you're probably losing the hobby to the business at that point.
And so so you got the hobby back. It's a really interesting way to look at it. And you obviously, that means you didn't lose your passion for woodworking as you had to make it a profession where it became more than just for fun. And all of a sudden there's, inventories and profit and loss statements and
Yeah.
balance
Yeah.
sheets. You maintain the love.
I did, right? It's been a journey, right? I would say the passion piece for the craft, for the woodworking craft, has never left me, because it's part of who I am, and I'm just kind of hardwired around quality and just making stuff, right? But all the other things, the peripheral stuff that you talked about, I had to learn how to run a business. I had to learn definitionally what even a profit and loss statement was, right? And marketing and HR and all this other stuff, right? So that unavoidably starts to take energy away from I guess that foundational passion that got me into the business in the first place. I think it's been a struggle to kind of, make sure you don't lose that, or make sure I don't lose that identity piece, while doing everything else that has to happen.
So as you were doing that and you were going into making this passion into a business, left a successful and growing career that I'm sure all the friends and family around you were maybe a little surprised of going from the stability to the instability. How did you go about thinking about learning some of those basics, right? Like, not, it's not even just learning how to run a business, but it's like your whole life experience, maybe short of the inventory you had to pick when you're picking wildflowers and reselling them, was really sort of that non-touch virtual infrastructure. You're starting a manufacturing business, and I guess it was probably what, 1999. So the end
95.
of the
Yep.
95, the end of the 20th century. I mean, there had to have been naysayers up the wazoo, kind of being like, Rick, what are you doing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everybody in my orbit at the time, when I shared the idea, it just kind of did like a head scratch. They're like, shutters. What?
Manufacturing
Really?
business in New Jersey? What year do you think this is? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So no, I got a lot of that. But at the time I was so confident in myself and driven. And there was a lot of fear wrapped around it. But at the end of the day, I just like set my sights on this and said, I don't care what anybody says. I'm just going to do it, and I'm gonna outwork, my failure points. Right. So that's
It's
how I looked at it.
And so when you went through to get it going, how did you go about sort of the original learning? Like, just like, I mean, was it just you sort of just went headlong and said you figure it out? Like, because there's just so much stuff between equipment and inventory and personnel. How'd you get
Yeah.
kind of going with that?
Just a ton of failure, honestly. And I want to stress again, this was 1995, right? So our culture today, we just completely take for granted like the ability to just jump on a keyboard or a phone and just
Yeah.
Google something, right? And when and my kids who are 29 and 25, right, they just can't even begin to get their head around the idea of not having that resource, right? But not all that long ago in the world, we didn't have that, right? So a lot of it was just magazines. It was talking to people. It was buying books, as silly as that sounds, right? And just I failed a lot, right? I mean, the thing nobody likes to talk about or gets easily forgotten is, you look at a business that's been around now 29 years, coming on 30 years, and oh my God, you got the successful business and blah blah blah. Yeah, but you know what? It was a 29-year journey to get there, and I almost failed and went out of business. I don't know, a few dozen times along the way, right? And nobody loves to talk about that, right? Or they blow past that as being, oh yeah, yeah, that's fine. But in the moment, that's very acute, right? And that fear of the life getting extinguished out of something that you birthed is quite real.
Do you remember sort of, because I know that especially in the beginning, there's so much hard work getting done to get this thing off the ground. It's like, it's just maybe like sort of the same frustration I imagine the Wright brothers felt trying to get that first plane off the ground. You're just
Yep.
putting so much energy in and you feel like you're getting no lift whatsoever. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I think I got something going here. Do you remember that moment where you're like, oh shit, I think this might actually work?
Yeah, I do. It was probably 6 months in from I guess my first order, if you will. And, up to that point, I would get an order. And although I had a very loosely defined parametric kind of library of styles and options that a customer could pick from, but truth be told, we were doing everything for the first time, right? And we tried to make it look like it was repeatable, but it was still the first time we were doing it. And I'd say about 6 months in, I remember getting an order, and at that time I was, doing everything. I was answering the phone, I was unloading the trucks, I was making shutters, I was putting them in a box, I was shipping them out, I was paying the bills. I literally did everything, right? So I remember trying to set up for this order and realizing, oh, well, we've done it 8 or 9 times. I say we, by the way, it's me, right? So I've done it 8 or 9 times, and all of a sudden I realized it's going a lot quicker. And a lot of the processes that, through trial and error, I learned on those first, I don't know, 7 or 8 orders, whatever the number was, I realized, oh, all right. So now if I build a system, instead of approaching this as a one-off, that becomes something that could scale. And at the time, I don't even think I knew how to define scale, right? But today I do, right? So I look back on it and go, yeah, that's I think was an inflection point where I realized, all right, if I'm going to get into custom manufacturing, I really have to lean in hard on processes and systems and repeatability. and, putting predictable kind of processes in place, so we're not having to redesign the wheel every single time.
Which
So
makes perfect sense, Rick, but it also seems counterintuitive when you're saying the word custom and then
yeah.
you're saying repeatable, scalable process. So, I mean, how do you put those two things together?
So I think from the very beginning, and leaving all the buzzwords out of it because I didn't really honestly know any of I guess industry terminology or jargon, but you know, I looked at it from the standpoint that we were building shutters to the 16th of an inch in width and length, so it's very much custom. But all of the framing components, and so think kitchen cabinet doors, or for that matter, think entry doors in your house. If you look at a door, most doors are about the same size, right? And you go in my house and your house, and the doors may look different, but there's a lot of commonality. The framing components are all about the same, right? And so shutters are similar in a way, right? So we've standardized, the frame components of the shutter. We could customize them all, but for the most part, most people don't need those customized. They just want them built to the right size, right?
Mhm.
So I knew from the beginning that what I was really doing was building, what today I would, use the formal term, it's mass customization, right? It's a highly configured product, but it's built around a library of styles and processes and components that are semi-standard, right?
So yeah, so it's essentially made to order. It is custom to a degree, but you're able to find all those different commonalities and then leverage that commonality to create a system that allows you to
Yeah.
maximize the way you can get it out the door. And so, you've talked a lot about the quality being so important up front. So, as you've grown and tried and scaled the business, and obviously it's much bigger than it was 29 years ago,
Right.
how have you maintained that focus on quality? Because I think
Mhm.
most people feel like scale and growth and quality are sort of diametrically opposed forces, and it's difficult to try and bring them together.
Yeah, and I keep using this term. It's been a journey, right? But I, I'd say probably 15 or 20 years ago, in my journey of trying to learn and improve and get better at manufacturing, I stumbled onto this idea of continuous improvement and lean manufacturing, and which is kind of like a whole theology almost around manufacturing discipline in just about any industry. And I quickly fell in love with all the ideas around it, right? So to me, and honestly to my whole team, we think about quality as getting really clear on the processes, right, and getting really clear on all the variables, and then having ruthless discipline to make sure that we execute consistently all the time. So it could take weeks, months, years on any given process to get it right, but then once you get it right and you realize that's the right way to do it, now this sounds simple but very hard to execute. Now you just have to do the same thing over and over again the same way, right? So
Very
such a
hard
simple
to
concept.
execute.
Yeah, and then you get humans in the mix, and people have their own subjectivity to it. So, and then the second piece of that, Ari, is it's I believe it's rooted in culture, right? So we have a culture which we talk about constantly. I mean, around quality and around expectations, and so everybody on the team truly understands what we're trying to do, to what level and what standard it needs to be done to, because that's who we are, right? I mean, we're not selling a commodity product. Our products are unapologetically expensive because of everything that goes into them, in terms of the best quality materials, the best joinery, the best craftsmanship, the attention to detail, all of that, and so everybody's aligned on that. But you can't say it once and expect people to remember because people, come and go. That's normal in business. So it just has to be a drumbeat that you talk about constantly, right? And it just becomes embedded in just about every communication that we have, every town hall meeting we have, every daily huddle we have with our team. And that's the way you eventually program the company around a certain set of ideals.
So let's take on that a little bit. I mean, very specifically, you quickly you rattled off a few quick things and
Yeah.
huddles and town halls and stuff, but I'd like to get much more specific if you could, and maybe dig into, you're trying to curate this culture that values quality that you said were unapologetically, I think you said expensive, but your prices are unapologetically high because people are coming to Timberlane because they want to have this level of quality, precision, execution. If they wanted some plastic junk, they could get it somewhere else, right?
Right.
So how do you think about what are the actual things you do, as specific as you can, to curate that culture so that it continues on in that same vein?
So I think one of the lessons that I learned fairly early that has become foundational in terms of how I think about spending my time is, it's all about people and it's all about the team that you build, right? And once you get your ego as an entrepreneur out of the way, you could have had the germ or the seed of an idea and you could have birthed it. But very quickly it becomes not about you, it becomes about, the team that you build to then grow that idea into something much bigger, right? And one of the things I wish I learned earlier on was getting super comfortable with saying I don't know, right? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, I know, just certainly describes myself. I felt this like self-imposed pressure to have every answer all the time with my team, because if I didn't have the right answer, I'm going to look dumb, and they're looking to me as the boss, and they're looking to me for direction, and the me today is super comfortable going, yeah, I really have no idea what the answer is, but why don't we go out and figure out what the answer is, or why don't you go out and figure out what the answer is, right? So I think culture and people become super important. And with that, I think there's a lot that you have to get right. And a lot of it is creating a vision, right, that people can rally around and they understand what we're trying to do, right? And, so it starts there, and then you start breaking that big idea. It's kind of like, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? So you take that big idea and then you start breaking it down into digestible chunks, which are, in our world, it's our meeting rhythms are really important, right? So, we will set a very long-term, Jim Collins coined the phrase BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal, right? So we'll have a really big idea, right? But then, if you just stop there, how do people rally around that? So then you got to chunk it down. You got to chunk it down into annual goals, and then take annual goals and break them down into quarterly goals, and then quarterly goals, and the monthly goals, and monthly goals, and the weekly goals, and weekly goals, and the daily goals, right? So I think we've done a really good job of that over time. And, then you have to take those goals, and then it's not really about the destination, but it's, well, how are you going to get there? Because it's always actions that contribute towards achievement of a goal. It's not the goal itself, right?
Yeah.
So setting a goal and saying, hey, we want to sell X number of shutters by this date, well, that's great. That's a great thing to put up on a board, right? But what it really comes down to is, what are the things we have to do every day? What are the actions we have to take that's going to get us closer to that goal, right? I think we do an above average job at that for a company of our size, right? And I modeled that, honestly. It's not my idea, right? I just looked at folks that were doing things like this really successful, and, I ripped it off, right? Whether it was a book, or whether it's a consultant, or whether it's a coach, and just went, all right, well, this is the toolbox we're going to put in place.
Well, listen, I mean, I'd say imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, right? So going after it,
Yeah,
I think
right.
certainly, yeah, certainly plays that out. So I'm going to ask you a couple more specific questions about that. I mean, you had so much there's to unpack, which we won't get to all of it. But if I listen to everything that you said, I would put forward that probably the most single biggest predictor of the ability to execute that level of tactics to reach the goals and the goals that reach the vision is making sure that the people that report to you, the next layer down, are the right people set up for success. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, for sure.
Because they got to carry your vision forward. So let me ask you this way: when you think about how do you make sure those people are the right people, how do you think about that?
How much time do we have?
Well, theoretically, as much
I'm
as we
kidding.
want, if we don't run out of tape, but
No, I understand. Sure. No, I think, to your point about there being a lot to unpack. I mean, any one of these topics in itself, we could do a deep dive on, but I think one of the other things I learned, and, a lot of times the learning for me at least comes through looking in the rearview mirror. A lot of times the windshield, it's a blank road. You don't, it's not obvious, at least to me, right? But sometimes you look in the rearview mirror and all of a sudden you could kind of codify things based on how it happened. So I think for me, getting the right butts in the right seats at the right time in a business's journey is super important. So somebody that is a rock star or an A player, as we would call them, maybe in year 3, in whatever role they're in, what the business needs then is them. But when the business is 5 times the size, that A player, you may not have grown at the same velocity that the business grew, right? So all of a sudden, that A player is no longer an A player by nothing that they did wrong, but by virtue of the fact that the business's needs evolved, got more complex, and you needed different things, right? So I think one of the very hard things of growing a business is you're constantly moving chess pieces on the board around, right? And you want to do it in as dignified and as a respectful way as possible, because somebody that was an A player to help you get from point A to point B, you need, well, I think it's a mutual thing. One, they have to continue to, that employee has to grow their skill sets on their own. But then the business, I think, has a responsibility to find a spot for them, right? And sometimes that doesn't happen. Either one or the other or both don't kind of come together at the same time. But so that's a tough spot, right? So your original question, I think, was how do you go about getting the right butts in the seat at the time? And a lot of it has to do with where the business is and what the business needs, right? Which is constantly changing.
So is that to say a constant evaluation of saying where are we today and where are we in light of what these people's skills and talents are?
For sure, right? Because the other thing, which we haven't talked about at all, the marketplace is constantly changing, right? So, what the market wanted, like we're in year 29, right? So I would argue that almost 100% of the way we do things today is different from the way I did them 29 years ago. Technology has completely changed how you do and think about everything. But the market's changed. Consumer behavior is different now. How we as consumers engage with companies that are trying to sell us stuff is completely different, right?
Even in your business, like your business, okay, so let's pivot over because I did want to get to sales and marketing too. This maybe will lead right to that. But I'm a little surprised, maybe educate me on how has the consumer behavior changed in what I would perceive to be a pretty staid market, right? Like I have a house or I don't have a house. I need or want wood shutters or don't. Like what has changed?
Let's see. So I think, and I don't think what I'm about to say, I think this is a challenge. It's not a good thing, but I think in our society, we have kind of evolved into somewhat of a disposable mentality for goods and services, right? And, we've got the quote unquote Amazon effect. I'll just buy a new one, right? So, in our world where we're selling quality, right, that cost more than most other alternatives, there needs to be a consumer mindset where they value that, right? So we can sell that value proposition all day long, but there needs to be a reception on the consumer end where they're going to take it in and that's going to influence how they make decisions. So I think the marketplace has changed a bit, right? Around how we think about spending our money on consumer goods and services. And then the other thing that's changed drastically is, you think about yourself if you're, trying to do research on a product. Let's say you're looking at a sofa that you want to buy a new sofa, right? 25 years ago, you'd go into a furniture showroom and you'd go into multiple showrooms and you'd look for sofas on the floor. Today, you're doing it all virtually, right? You're doing visualizers. You are, looking at online websites. You're going on social media threads to get ideas. You're looking at, so as a company that's focused on marketing, you need to react to all of that and make sure you're there. Because if you're not there in the way that consumers are looking for companies, then you're just, you become irrelevant really fast, right?
So that's a really great point. So, we talked about the quality of your product. You found a need, you develop a quality product. Obviously, that's all true. You found a market need that can be met by what you're doing. But if no one knows about it, what good is it? And so, talked a little bit about kind of how you found that sales and marketing importance and how you've sort of grown with it. Because I think, one of the things we didn't talk about too much, but I'll touch on now is you don't sell through distributors, right? This is
Right.
what I think today we would call DTC, before DTC was cool. And
Right.
and so you've got to you have to not just develop an expertise in designing, building high quality products, but you also got to develop an expertise in reaching the people that want to buy those products. So maybe walk us through a little bit of that journey.
Sure, sure. And I just to qualify a bit, so about half of our business, I'm speaking in general terms, about half of our customers are high-end homeowners, right? I wouldn't call them DIYers. We would call them do it. That's do it yourself. We would call them do it for me's, right? So
Right.
these are typically affluent homeowners, that are going to hire somebody to put the shutters on. But from our perspective, we're selling to the homeowner. The other half we're selling, and it's actually growing, so it's actually starting to become the more dominant piece of our business is selling to trade professionals that serve those same type of homeowners. So think custom home builders, renovation contractors, anybody in the design community, an architect, a designer, a decorator, right?
Got it.
So
Which is a much more efficient one sale that then sells to more people beyond.
Exactly, right. So when we think about how to sell, I believe in high touch, right? And I think that all of the technology tools that exist today to have virtual communications with people are good because we all use them, right? We text, we chat, we want that, right? But I think a lot's been lost because I think so many companies have pivoted so hard into this completely virtualized experience that, the human to human connection is gone, right? So we believe pretty strongly in making sure that we have a high touch. Our product, to really be understood, takes somebody who really knows what they're doing to talk to our customers about it, right? Because it's not what it appears on the surface, right? It's highly configured, which means we really, the customer has a lot of decision points to make. And most of the time they've never bought shutters like this before. So there's a lot to go wrong, right? And although we have all the best tools on our website and calculators and tutorials and all of that, but nothing takes the place of having, a really seasoned professional that knows the product, right? And knows all of the pitfalls and the potholes. And we see our job as trying to prevent our customers from making costly mistakes, right? So that it's a win-win and everybody's happy, right?
So I mean, when you're trying to reach a high end homeowner, and let me ask it a different way. You're building the product. You got to get out there and market. How do you even go about learning how to do the marketing? Right, it's not part of your direct job. It wasn't part of your passion originally. How'd you get started figuring out the best way to do it?
So I was in sales and marketing before I started the business. So I had some exposure to lead generation, business development, and actually a sales process, right? Having said that, all of the technologies that existed then, it was a very analog world then compared to what it is today, right? So, but a lot of it was just trial and error, right? I mean, we took out in the beginning lots of print ads in the back of magazines. And so think any magazine, that existed in new construction or renovation or things like that. We took out an ad and it was simply, this is who we are. This is what we make. Call this 1-800 number and we'll send you a catalog, right? And we did that hundreds of thousands of times, right? We would send out, on average, a couple thousand catalogs a week, right? And then, as a sales guy, I'm like, all right, that's great. But now we should call that person to make sure they got the catalog, see if they have any questions, and then kind of start that process, start that dialogue, right? And over time, over a couple decades, people stopped answering their phone, right? To think about how you navigate the world now. Your phone's blowing up all the time with, bots and,
Ugh.
and robocalls and all that. So it's become a challenge for us to get people on the phone. They'd much rather text or they'd much rather see an email, right? And, so the challenge for us is we're really good when we get people on the phone. We're also good at all the digital journey too. But how do you distinguish yourself? So a lot of it comes down to meeting people where they are. So if somebody wants to communicate via email, well, we're going to communicate via email. We're going to certainly try to get them on the phone, right? And at some point in in that process of configuring and ultimately placing an order for custom shutters, we will absolutely have at least one, most of the time, multiple conversations with customers. But we've just had to morph along the way, right? And we'll probably continue to have to morph, right? As technology continues to give us new tools and different ways of communicating.
So you must make sales and marketing, both the strategy and the execution, just as pivotal and top of mind to what you're doing as it is thinking about the next product you're going to come out with from a shutter standpoint, or the next CNC machine, or the next ERP upgrade. Sounds like you must be spending at least as much time thinking about the go-to-market strategy as the product itself.
Yeah, I would say at least as much, if not more, on the sales and marketing side. And I'll apologize in advance to all the operations people out there, including my team. But I've said it many times: nothing happens until somebody sells something first, right? Now, in the beginning, I overcompensated for that and we would sell stuff. I'm like, well, let's just sell stuff and we'll figure out how to make it. Well, I've grown a healthy respect over many, many years that you can't trivialize a complex manufacturing operation. So, I look at the business like we're two different businesses. I look at the business as we are a custom manufacturer with all of the complexities that go along with that, and all of the compliance and just all of the just complexities, right? And then we're also a direct marketing business where we are having to generate leads. We are having to figure out we already know who our customer is, but we have to go to where they are and and find them. We have to find people that are interested in our product, and then we have to open up a conversation and serve them in whatever way they want. So one without the other can't really exist, right? So
Yeah, no, fair enough. Well, listen, I wanted to cover one more topic before we wrap it up, and it's just near and dear to my heart. It's another overlap between you and I. But I know one of the things that you credit to some of your success was your time in the Entrepreneurs Organization, and I just wonder if you wouldn't mind just sharing with the audience how you found the organization, how you think about your impact there, and kind of where your entrepreneur educational journey is today.
yeah, no, I would say hands down, without hesitation, the single thing that I would attribute to most of my professional, and for that matter, even personal and relationship success, has come from my involvement in EO and after EO, YPO. So these are executive peer-to-peer groups, right? And I didn't even know these existed, right? So if somebody would have told me when I started my business, hey, you should look into these peer groups, right away, I'm sure I would have propelled even quicker, right? And the advice that I give, if asked, to a fledgling entrepreneur or somebody in an early startup phase is find your tribe now. Don't wait until you think you have the time, but find peer-to-peer groups, whether it's EO, whether it's Vistage, whether it's YPO, whatever flavor, whatever form that is, but find a community of other like-minded entrepreneurs that are dealing with the same stuff, right? That you can lean on. Let them be your virtual board of directors and build your Rolodex that way, right? So it's critical. I think without that, it's a lonely journey and you're on your own, right? And when you
It,
have that, it becomes empowering,
There's
right?
no doubt about it, and it's interesting. You talked about it, and it impacted us both in the same way. And I wish I could say that the first time I heard about it, I jumped right on it. I said no, I didn't have enough time the first time.
Yeah,
It was
we
like
all
two
do.
two and a half years for me to finally join up, and then I just spent the next how many years kicking myself for not doing it sooner. But
Yeah.
it's so interesting, and I wonder if you could maybe touch on a little bit your thoughts around the value of peer-to-peer learning, because I think one of the challenges I had thinking about joining a group like that was I didn't have any really experience in peer-to-peer learning. The traditional school model, which you and I both kind of feel the same way about, it doesn't have that. It's more of a instructor-led type
Yeah.
training, and I never had experience with peer-to-peer, but boy, was it powerful.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody that's ever joined any of these organizations, has had any experience before. So, I remember the first time, I went to a training session, forum, obviously for your listeners, is where you get, anywhere from 7 to 9, non-competing other entrepreneurs, and you meet on a regular basis, and you have a fairly structured kind of rhythm in terms of how you conduct that meeting, but most of it revolves around this idea that you're bringing an issue that you're dealing with, whether it's personal or business, but then you're talking about it in a way that's very different than we were ever taught, right? So I learned about this thing called Gestalt protocol, which is speaking from experience, right? And I remember the facilitator talking about the why behind it. And there was a disconnect because I'm like, no, I got a problem. I want somebody to tell me what I should do, right? And they're like, well, you've got a pretty strong personality, the way most entrepreneurs do. You're a type A, right? So chances are, if somebody said you should do this, you'd probably, go, screw off, I'm going to do it my way anyhow. Versus if somebody that you respect says, you know what, I had the same type of problem, and this is how I handled it when I was confronted by that. And you're hearing it through a different like lens, right? Now somebody's not telling you what to do because now your guard is down. Now you're hearing it from somebody that's simply sharing their experience, and that just blew my mind and opened my world, right? And once you learn that, you realize, oh my God, this is like this is the way I want to consume advice in a non-advice driven way.
It's amazing. And it's so funny. Just hearing you say it brings back so many memories. We've implemented that and leveraged it at work too, in certain meetings, bringing that sort of presentation style. And it is amazing how the exact same information framed up in a different way just hits so much better and is so much more like, I don't know if it's the word digestible or consumable makes any sense, but it hits in a way that's so much more likely for you to get positive action on your own out of it. It's life-changing.
It really is, for sure.
Well, listen, I appreciate you sharing that, Rick. And neither of us are paid spokespeople, as far as I know, anyway, for any of those organizations. But it literally changed my life as it did yours. And so, any opportunity to get another voice in that chamber, to have someone else out there who's maybe a young Rick or a young Ari who heard about it but didn't join it, or hasn't heard about it and now has, I couldn't recommend it any higher.
Yeah, and I feel exactly the same way.
So before we wrap it up here, I just want to ask you a few quick questions. We make a list and like to get this from all the entrepreneurs and business leaders that we talk to. So do you have a favorite business book, one that you would recommend to someone if they were like, hey, Rick, what's the business book? If I had to read one, what should I read?
Wow. It's always tough to distill it down because there's so many good ones, right? I know you asked for one. I'm going to give you two.
Part of the under promise, over deliver there.
Yeah, well, it's just I don't like rules, right? So, first business book, which I have recommended countless times to new entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs, everywhere in between, is The E-Myth by Michael Gerber. That it's kind of like a playbook on how to build a business, and it just overly simplifies, and all of a sudden, like for me, it just opened my mind up to the simplicity and the complexity, but at the end of the day, that the power that comes from coming up with repeatable ideas and processes and all that. So that's a big one. The second one, and the reason I wanted to share too, is because I don't know that I'd call it a business book, but it's something I discovered, I guess, about 7 or 8 months ago, and it has really impacted me in a huge way. It's called From Strength to Strength by Albert Brooks. And this is really talking about aging, which, and I've read it a few times, I've listened to podcasts, but, some of the central theme here is that as you get older, when you're younger, you've got this thing called fluid intelligence, right? Where you're just like thinking fast and you're executing fast and it's just all about action, right? And it's messy because you're young and you haven't thought through all of these things yet, right? But as you get older and you age, right? And I'm 57, so, over the last 5 or 6 years, I have, very reluctantly, I admit that I've caught myself slowing down and I'm not as quick, on my feet anymore, right? And I was struggling to kind of put a reason onto that. And the other side of this fluid intelligence, as you get older, it turns to this thing called crystallized intelligence or wisdom, right? And I realized, now my role as I get older is really a transfer of all of these life lessons, right? And mentoring and coaching my team and other entrepreneurs and embracing that instead of fighting it, right? And realizing that that's just kind of the journey that we're on. We can't stop aging, right? But you can do it in a little bit more of a graceful way and lean into the things that can actually deliver value to not only yourself, but to everybody around you. So I would definitely recommend that book, honestly, to anybody. It'll change the way you think about how you think.
That's really great. Not one I had heard of, so I got that one down for myself.
Yeah.
Last two questions here, Rick. First one is, what's something that you learned early in your life or early in your career that you think really helped propel you to all the success that you've had?
So I'm a very impatient person, the way most entrepreneurs are, and I always have I always have a sense of urgency around everything, right? To the point where I'm sure it drives everybody around me crazy. I don't walk from point A to point B. I'm usually like somewhere between a jog and a run, and something that maybe takes should take an hour. I want to get it done in 12 minutes, right? And so I think that sense of urgency, I think, has served me well, because when you're trying to burst something, velocity is really important. Now, I would add to that, what I've learned along the way is how important patience is, which I did not have a lot of. So I think this dichotomy of maintaining a sense of urgency and velocity and movement, right, towards the achievement of anything is important, but also realizing when patience is equally as important, right? Because in the beginning, I would argue, it's all about sprints, right? And you're just trying to sprint and run to that next level. But what we don't realize often as entrepreneurs is we're really in a long game. We're really in like a super long endurance race, which should be comprised of healthy sprints, but then also a patience and a resolve to just stick with the things that are right, because in the end, they're going to pay big dividends.
So that actually may be the answer to my follow-up question, and maybe you gave me the yin and the yang, because my
Yeah.
follow-up question was going to be, what's something you learned later in your life and later in your career that if you could go back and tell young Rick, and if he'd listen to you, it'd really make a positive impact on him? And it sounds like sort of putting that patience combined with the energy is what you would say.
Yeah, sorry, I rambled there, but yeah, I would say that would definitely be my answer. It's trying to figure out how to marry, the friction between being impatient with being patient when it's the right move.
And that honestly, it's a really, no more to add to that. Really terrifically, couldn't agree with you more. I literally love that concept you have of like kind of move quickly, because as that young entrepreneur, you've got to fail fast. So you got to keep moving and don't stop. But by the same token, if you just keep bouncing around from different ideas and don't try anything long enough, you're never going to actually get the long-term success. It sounds like that's really the takeaway that you got as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Rick, man, I super appreciate this conversation. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate you spending our time with us today,
Yeah.
and look forward to staying in touch with you on the journey.
Awesome. Ari, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by Compass MSP.